Hello and welcome, Brandon Srot. Welcome to the Better World Leaders podcast.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Mate, thank you so much for coming down today to the studio. We've had some absolutely wonderful conversations over the, I'm going to say years, I'm going to struggle to name how many it's been since we first got acquainted. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to creating something equally meaningful to our previous conversations that we can now share with the world.
As am I. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
No, it's awesome. So to be consistent, let's just explore first of all, sort of where you've come from to bring you here today. So just tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. It's a big question. I think I will begin off by saying that I grew up in South Africa, and I lived there until I was 18.
Yeah.
But I grew up during the tail end of apartheid. And that had a huge influence on who I am, and I'm sure we'll touch on that as the conversation unfolds. But in terms of who am I, a big part of me is a South African.
Sure.
And particularly a white South African. And that has meaning, and it has implications in terms of the context that I come from, and what that afforded me, and what that allowed for me, and what that made possible for me throughout my life. I moved to Australia when I was 18, which was about almost 21 years ago. And since then, I have continued a long career in the non-profit sector, particularly in the Jewish non-profit sector. And I've trained as well and practice now as a psychotherapist and leadership coach. So a lot of my work is working with individuals, couples, and sometimes groups in therapy. But then a lot of my work is also in the realm of adaptive leadership, which I'm sure we'll touch on more too as well. And I also teach at the Masal Leadership Center in Israel, where we teach adaptive leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just to hop onto one point specifically, and sort of wanting to not entirely make this a topical conversation, but I think it's very poignant. We've seen this, repeated rising, sort of tide of awareness around Black Lives Matter, and this whole sort of conundrum of privilege, versus lack thereof. What has this sort of most recent, sort of period of time been like for you, from that origin and with that perspective that you have?
It's really interesting to watch what's happening unfold. It certainly has echoes of the world that I grew up in and the world that I come from. At the same time, I feel very energized and very excited about what's happening, because I believe that this sort of change needs to happen rapidly in a radical way.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily always agree with the methodologies around what's happening and how things are happening, but I agree with the principle.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a change we need to see in order to make for us a better world.
Yeah, 100%.
So I support the movement in principle.
Yeah.
And I look forward to a day where this is history.
Yeah. No, that's beautifully put, and I couldn't agree more. I've got 2 little kids, and my daughter's godfather is Indigenous Australian. Then we have a lot of conversations, about the specific context of Black Lives Matter in Australia, and there is absolutely an opportunity. Like you, I can absolutely sympathise with a lot of the raw emotion, but I wouldn't necessarily say that I, as somebody who focuses on behaviour change and sort of how to invoke positive behaviour change to make change stick and get things done, I wouldn't necessarily agree with all of the methodologies, but I'm glad that the one thing the methodologies have invoked so far is awareness on a very, very broad scale, that this is not an American problem, it's not a South African problem, like this is just a species level thing that we need to deal with.
Absolutely, and it's happening right in our backyard.
Yeah.
And it needs our attention.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. So, just as a sort of a segue, what I suppose would you identify as the sort of the drawing factors that took you on this specific sort of series of steps to bring you into the leadership space? Where was the sort of the original point of calling that you had something to contribute in that arena?
I have a very vivid memory of a moment at school, actually, in high school,
Okay.
in the mid-90s. And we were told one day that a school choir was coming to perform at our Friday assembly. And this choir was very famous. In fact, they had just won some international school choirs competition. And they were a school choir from a black school in Cape Town. And we had heard about them for weeks. I mean, we were told for weeks that they were coming to perform. Anyway, the Friday arrived and the assembly opened, and eventually this band and this choir, I should say choir, there was no band, appeared on the stage, and they performed the most incredible performance I think I've ever heard in my life until that point. It was only after their performance that they revealed to us that they actually have no instruments. They have no musical room, like classroom in their school. That everything that they do is just with their hands, their voices, their feet, with their bodies. And it amazed me that without any sort of resources that we took for granted in our private, day school in Cape Town, they were able to go to the international stage and win this competition. And it made me think, what do I want to do here? Like, I knew that they wanted a piano. They had told us that they were saving and raising money for a piano. And I thought, what do I want to do here? Do I want to get involved? Do I just want to go to my class now and pretend like this moment never happened? But it was a bit of a choice point for me in my life. And I decided at that point to get involved in some school leadership programs. And we actually landed up raising all the funds for their pianos. We bought them 2 pianos in the end and a variety of other school instruments. In the end, it wasn't actually about the instruments. It was about this journey for me that it took me on of feeling the need and the calling to really step up to what was happening in my environment. And here was just a little microcosm of a much broader challenge in society. So from a very young age, I got involved in social justice causes, school leadership programs, and eventually I joined the City Council of Cape Town as a junior councillor for 3 years. And that was an amazing opportunity for me too, to meet a diversity of other students from around the city, different backgrounds, different stories, histories, ethnicities, and to find ways of working together. Even though we were school students, we found interesting ways to work together to try to improve life in Cape Town, but also to bring a bit of a young voice into the mainstream or the broader pejorative. That was a very empowering time for me. And I think that it left quite an indelible mark on who I am and who I wanted to become as an adult in my life. And really since then, I've just had a number of opportunities to build myself, to build my leadership capabilities, to step into leadership roles. And it wasn't intentional. I think just slowly but surely this momentum started to build. And here we are today having this conversation.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for sharing. I mean, that's an incredible story. And yeah, what a way to interpret the gift that choral performance gave you.
Yes.
Right,
absolutely.
like as you say, like you could easily have just essentially gone, oh, that was amazing, and on with my day, and my life and whatever, right? But you internalized it and received it in a very different way. And I think what I was reflecting on, not having been to South Africa, but having had a number of interactions with different now sort of expatriated South Africans over the year, I think what I was sort of ruminating on as you were describing that experience was, this is a bit of a leap, so just bear with me a moment. There's this sort of premise that I'm aware of within neuroscience that a lot of behaviour change is founded on fear or love, right? And a response to one of those two things. I think what's the contrast with you and how you've sort of pointed at that experience really as one of a receipt of love, and then your response is with love. Contrast with a lot of the conversations I've had with other expatriated South Africans where it's all rooted in fear. that this obviously is a very turbulent, very dangerous society in a lot of ways, especially sort of back in the 80s and 90s, right? There was a lot of conflict. And a lot of their reflections on the moment that got them into action were an evocation of fear. And I think it's particularly poignant, knowing as I do a little bit more now about you and reflecting on what I knew before about what you do and how much of what you do now I would equate sort of in that love bucket, right? You're intervening with people, as a sort of a positive energy to bring them more into a point of positivity in their own lives. I think you're right. I think that's, you don't need me to tell you this, but this is the genesis of where you sit today, is of receiving this great gift. But the other thing is knowing that one of the points that you and I aligned on very, very early was around the power of human potential. And again, let's look at this one poignant moment that you've gone to. What a perfect demonstration of the raw power of human potential, right? This choir literally had nothing other than the vessel of themselves and their voices, and look what they managed to achieve. What a spellbinding depiction of that power of human potential, and again, that's now what you're doing. So good self-analysis, my friend.
I'll give that over to many years of therapy. But yeah, it's interesting you use the word potential, because I often say that my kind of professional life these days is dedicated to the development of human potential and connection. And I really do see these as the bedrock of leadership.
Yeah, absolutely.
These days. And particularly the sort of leadership that we need in today's world.
Yeah, I mean, we could just sort of basically say right now that's what we're going to talk about, but there's a lot of other permeations to this. But I'm so with you on that, and I think that's been one of the ways and sort of modalities through which you and I have bonded relatively quickly. That I think it was within moments of one of our first conversations, maybe even the first conversation, I mentioned something about potential, and you just sort of went, right, we're going to have a good conversation. So it's interesting, isn't it, the power of language, that these specific terms that very early on identified somebody at least as of the orientation and how they navigate and how they perceive the world is the same as you.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's talk about what you do to activate and enable potential.
Sure. So, where shall I begin with that? What do I do? I kind of really see all of my work these days across psychotherapy, facilitation, and leadership training really speaking to that same end point of potential and connection, but they permeate in different ways across these different kind of areas of the work that I do. In terms of the, when it comes to leadership training and development, how I would kind of frame this perhaps is I endeavor to create environments where individuals, teams, groups of people can, in a here and now experiential way, build their capacities to deal with uncertainty, to deal with conflict, to deal with difference, to deal with not knowing, to deal with not being the expert in that moment, in that example that they're trying to deal with, whatever it is. And this is done through the curation of basically working groups. And so I really love to do a lot of this work in group environments where people can come together around a particular challenge or issue and be taken through a very intentional process of trying to make progress through that issue, not necessarily solving it or fixing it in the most rapid way possible, but slowly making progress. And as we do that, we're actually building our own interpersonal capabilities to be relational with each other, to have deep and important and courageous conversations with each other, to lean into the uncertainty, as I said before. Because so much of the world right now is calling on us for a very different type of leadership. I think we're very used to the charismatic leadership model. All these programs and trainings and workshops that tell you, how to stand, how to talk, how to dress, the best ways to do X, Y, and Z, and all of that, right? I love all these articles that keep coming up, 10 ways to change the world, like as if it's all that easy, right? and yet still look at the way of the world these days. Yet we've got this plethora of easy guides on how to do things. So I that's kind of where my leadership journey began, but I took a radical left turn at some point because I thought this is not really what we need right now. When we're dealing with issues of racism, speaking of Black Lives Matter, when we're talking about issues of climate change, these are massive issues for which there is no expert answer. And it doesn't matter how well I'm groomed or how well I speak or whatever tools I have in my toolbox, that's not going to fix the issue very quickly or very rapidly in the way that we need to. What we do need is we need to find ways of engaging with each other from a place of our values. We need to be able to assess our loyalties. We need to be able to say, I don't know what to say, or I don't know what to do. Can you help me? And it's those sorts of uncertainties that I try to build the capacity for in the work that I do around adaptive leadership.
Thank you for that. There's a heck of a lot in there. I'm going to try and sort of tease out some of the key points, but also I'm going to put sort of a pin in the map right now and go, right, that's the adaptive leadership hook. We're going to come back there, but just in probably a few minutes. So I love that. I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, as the historian in me tends to go, okay, well, let's just look back. Let's look at, I don't know, since the end of serfdom, we've been, you know, sort of orientating ourselves towards inspirational leaders, right? Like whether it's a religious figure or a political figure or a war hero or whatever. And then, there's been this sort of reductionism where it's like, okay, so how do those people look? How do those people talk? Like, how do the marks that they hit to deliver that message? And I think that there's been this sort of superficial mask that's then been applied to what a leader is. And you look at somebody very controversial as a leadership figure like Winston Churchill, and then you'd sort of say, oh, but Winston Churchill was a great leader. Let's just look at these quotes and look at what he said and look at how he landed a soundbite. That's what makes a great leader. And I think that's not even a tenth of what it takes. And that was then, and this is now. So the humility, the respect, the adaptability, we're getting there. The willingness to say, my role as a leader is to do this, and really this is make the decision. And take accountability if it goes wrong, and then make another decision, versus essentially just celebrate what's gone well, and push the accountability for everything else somewhere else, because I have to present this particular persona in the world at all times. And I mean, I can take that and go right down. What does that do for resilience, and what does that do for creativity, and what does that do for productivity, and what does it do actually for inspiration over a period of time when you've run out of icons, or when your heroes fail you, right? And then we end up with disenfranchisement and discontent and all of these things.
Yeah, and that's interesting because in the adaptive world, we don't like to speak about leaders. We like to speak about people who exercise leadership, because we don't see leadership as a noun. We see it as a verb. It's something we do.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's available to all of us, and that we don't need the fancy car at the bottom of the building, or the corner office with the beautiful city view, or the huge paycheck in order to exercise leadership, which is very much part of what you're saying, that iconoclastic kind of approach to leadership, that we look up towards these people with fancy titles and call them leaders.
Yeah, I think we almost need to reframe it. So often the conversation is about who leaders are, as opposed to what leaders do. Like if you say to anybody, go take a street poll, who are your top 5 leaders? The thought process that most people will naturally go into is who leaders are, name 3 people, versus what do leaders do, name 3 people that I've seen doing that stuff. So I think, we need to start a campaign to systemically recreate what leadership is implied as.
Now, when I'm just thinking right now about Rosa Parks. And I know that Rosa Parks was not operating alone at the time, and it was part of a broader project and enterprise.
She married into the movement and all that stuff. But even so, what she did.
But in that moment of refusing to stand up for her seat, from her seat for a white man, she kind of changed the world in a way. Like, we're still talking about her, right? How many times does that happen on a bus?
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it's available to us, this ability to exercise leadership. It's available to us in the most sometimes inconspicuous places and times, like on a bus.
Yeah.
You know, and I think the world is really crying out. There's all these moments crying out for us to intervene, to exercise leadership, to call out racism, to call out awful behavior on the bus, etc., etc. How many of us actually do it? Because it's risky.
There was a particular instance that I'll just reflect on briefly, and then we'll go back to what is adaptive leadership to you and what do you do with it. But just speaking to that, so I had a very good friend at high school. He and I were sort of elected student body leaders, and he was just my good buddy. Rish, he was a good friend. He was a mate. There were 2 black kids in our school. He was Mauritian. Rishi was Mauritian, and there was this instance when, after we'd finished high school, and he was walking down the street in Cambridge, like one of the sort of the nicest, most gentrified parts of England where I grew up. And basically there was an altercation with a group of racist thugs who really sort of got into him. And he was with a bunch of our school friends, none of whom intervened. You know, they immediately went into fear and into, you know, what would this do for me? And this really affected Rish in a very profound way. He dropped out of uni. He would always been a very outgoing, ever vivacious guy, but this I think, for him was the first sort of physical manifestation of this inherent latent hate, and it really affected him deeply. And yeah, it wouldn't, you know, like my friends were not Bruce Lee, like they wouldn't have necessarily stopped what happened, but I think, and I've spoken with Rish at length about this over the years, like just one of them, let alone, I think there are 4 or 5 of them, just showing up and just trying to intervene would have meant that the resonance of that event would have been very, very different for him.
Absolutely, absolutely. And look how that's impacted his life,
Exactly.
and even yours.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah. So let's talk about adaptive leadership. That it's a verb, that it's a doing thing. So what is adaptive leadership to you?
Sure. So I really understand and see adaptive leadership as a change management process.
Okay.
That when we use the word adaptive, what we're actually talking about is adaptation.
Yeah.
Right?
Adapting.
Yeah. How do we pivot from where we are to where we want to be?
Yeah.
And what's the process in between those 2 points that needs to happen?
Yeah.
Or what needs to occur? I kind of think about the butterfly, you know, the caterpillar who goes into the cocoon and emerges as a butterfly. The cocoon would be the adaptation or the adaptive leadership process. What's going on in that hub of discussion, interrogation, work, progress, that's going to cause us to emerge on the other side of it in a different form? What do we need to lose? What do we need to give up? What do we need to say goodbye to in order to emerge in a different way? And similarly, what do we need to try more of? And where do we need to innovate? And what do we need to do anew or afresh in order to create that change? So I really see adaptive leadership as that process of adaptation. And I've often wondered why it's not actually called adaptation leadership, because sometimes the word adaptive is a bit misleading. But anyway, that's for another time.
Sure.
But yeah, so we don't necessarily rely on this charismatic leadership approach to doing that sort of work. We want to understand what are the capabilities within the team. How can we come together to really find a way through, to make progress through the challenges that we're facing so that we can emerge on the other side? So I kind of think of adaptive work as more, it's kind of process work. You know, it's not just a one-hit wonder, come and do a workshop and tomorrow morning you'll wake up a superstar. This is really a process of self-inquiry, collective inquiry, understanding what is the problem. We talk a lot about diagnosing the situation, diagnosing the problem, holding multiple realities and interpretations of what might be happening, all with the view to intervention. Yeah, so then what do we do with all of that awareness and all of that insight and all of that knowledge? And intervention might be simply asking someone a question that you've never spoken to find out what's their perspective on a particular issue. But that can be very risky to do. That can be a very vulnerable act to do in a group of senior leaders. Or an intervention might be to share part of your story and really humanize yourself in the workplace, which is also something that we don't often do in today's world. So, I mean, there's a whole range of interventions. An intervention might be to hold up a mirror to the group and say, look at this awful dynamic that's happening amongst us, you know, and being that daredevil that says, look in the mirror, guys. So there's no prescriptive list of interventions when it comes to adaptive leadership, but I guess the prism, the perspective that we're taking here is what can people do? What's available to different people in the system to mobilize the system? And it doesn't necessarily need to be huge, expensive, audacious. It could be as simple as having a conversation.
Yeah. The conversation has to be the right one.
Yes.
It has to be, to use some words we seem to use in here a lot, one of humility, one of respect, one of curiosity. And I think it's so interesting to me because, I have a degree in organisational behaviour, but a lot of what I do is intuitive. And that's down to my psyche. I tend to sort of be a little bit impulsive. Just ask my wife. But I'll do and consider that to be an experiment. And I think certainly in the years that I've become more and more familiar with more and more senior, executive, C-level, board-level leaders, I see less and less of that intuition either being allowed to drive, or just basically the awareness of it just completely diminishes. And that reductionism, again, is it born out of fear? Is it born out of adopting the incumbent system where people don't ask for fear of, or they don't engage for fear of, or whatever? Like it's a real point of inherent curiosity to me. Like, why is it that these people who are employed, because they're incredibly smart and they're incredibly experienced and they're incredibly sort of powerful in their potential, kind of diminish so many of those factors by not adopting these behaviours? Do you sort of have a view on that?
I think fear does play into it a lot of the time. What will they think of me? Will I get that promotion if I sound stupid or silly or like I don't know what I'm talking about? Will I offend someone? There's so many layers of fear. I think another dimension here is authority relations.
Sure.
That as an employee of a system who's not at the top of the pyramid, we have expectations of the people at the top of the pyramid. We expect them to know everything, to do everything correctly and in the most efficient ways, to have all the answers. And I think that when we look up the pyramid for the answers, for the expertise, we kind of forget that we have our own.
Yeah.
And we relinquish our own capabilities, in this case to intervene, but a whole variety of capabilities. So part of the work that we do in adaptive leadership as well is to bring attention to what's happening in the authority relationship between you and the authority, what's playing out there. And that's going to happen in the groups that we work with in the room, because the facilitator will be seen as an authority.
Yeah.
And how the group relates to and interacts with the facilitator or facilitators will be a microcosm of what happens in that system between middle management and top management, or the fresh grad and the CEO of the organization. And how do we work with it? Is there something we can do in the group, between facilitator and group, that will give them a new experience of acting in their own capacity to exercise leadership without relinquishing themselves because of this authority relationship?
Yeah.
But I think typically, we always say there's three things we expect from authority: protection, keep us safe; direction, tell us where we're going, what's the vision, what's the purpose; and order. Tell me what's my role, what's your role, how are we going to do this, right? But in the process, we forget that maybe we have a perspective, maybe we have an idea, maybe we have something we want to contribute to that conversation, to that discussion, to the vision of the organization. But sometimes we just think, they've got it.
Yeah.
So I'll step away.
I mean, it's so interesting just hearing you go through that description of those sort of classic interactions and the authority, sort of receiver of authority status. I mean, if we look at the list of, the high achieving organisations these days, none of them would operate like that culturally. Right? They're very inclusive, they're very participative, it's not a top-down hierarchy, it's very, very organic. And I'm also reflecting back on a conversation that we had here with Ben Bowen, who's an Aboriginal leader, and we were talking there about the comparative example of the way that an elder engages with knowledge transfer and capability transfer with a group compared to the way it's typically done in a Western hierarchy. And in an Indigenous environment, not necessarily every time, but the normalised way for an elder to interact with a group is to sit down within the group. So that's two things that we would almost never do. And even if a leader is sitting, in our context, they're sitting on a stage, on a dais, in a position of sort of authority, but typically they're not sitting down, they're standing, and then everybody else is seated, and that's that immediate subconscious sort of power display. I'm up here, you're down there. And then there's also the separation. The leader sits or stands in a different position away from the group, as opposed to part of the group, enabling the group, using that lever of curiosity to try and invoke some participation, to your point. People engaging with this, where do we want to go and how do we do it?
I remember years ago when I worked at a non-profit, I had an amazing team, and I had the privilege and the joy of managing this team. And we had a lot of fun, a lot of creativity, all of it. And I remember one day we invited the board chair to come to one of our team meetings to meet the rest of the team. And on that occasion, this incredible team of mine went silent.
Yeah, right.
And I was so embarrassed because here she was, our board chair. She took time out of her day. She schlepped over to the office to have an hour with us. And it was like the worst performance ever.
Yeah.
I thought, what the hell's going on here? But I didn't know then what I know now. And probably when I think back to it, there was something going on there about authority relations. And yes, she was even sitting at the table with us at our level. But I think we get seduced by authority in so many different ways. Age, length of service, role in an organization, knowledge, experience. There's so many different ways that it happens. And I think we're born into it. Literally from the moment we're born, we are put into the arms of authority, whether it's a midwife, a doctor, and then our caregivers, or parents, whoever it is, guardians, literally. And we're dependent on them, right? To look after us, to make sure we're safe, to feed us, to nourish us. And I think somehow this just travels with us throughout our lives. I think we have those similar expectations in different forms from authorities in the workplace.
Oh, no, I agree, and I think certainly the conventional systems of education and employment, they just reinforce that, right? You go to school, where's the teacher, where are the students? What's the position of the teacher? What's the position of the students? And then when you enter the workplace, I think there's been some sort of elementary shifts in most workplaces, such as open plans. So there's not the corner office has maybe shifted. But I agree with you entirely. I think we need to be much more explicit in addressing these implicit authority channels. It's something that we spoke with Michael Bungestania about, and he's got a whole sort of body of work building around power and essentially calling out what's implicit in order to essentially better.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what I love about the adaptive teaching modality, because we have a modality called case-in-point facilitation, which is a teaching methodology in which we use the dynamics that are happening in the group in a very live, experiential way to bring attention to these ideas, to these theories, to these concepts. So rather than being the expert who stands on the stage and gives the lecture with the nice PowerPoint slides about here's how you do it, we're actually doing it in an experiential way. And we're being pushed to the edges of our comfort zones in the moment. And I think that's the very best way to build our capacity. to really be confronted and pushed and held at the same time to try something new, to when you have the awareness of what's happening for you in relation to others, or what's happening within the team or in the system, to then intervene in a different way can be profoundly life-changing.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's not just, ethereal or cognitive or academic, but it's actually embodied and experiential.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to use phrases like nurturing and cultivating.
Yeah.
Because you have the support mechanism, but you also have the sort of the sustenance.
Yeah.
And you have the reward, right? We look at behavior change. You need the stimulus, you need the prompt.
Yeah.
But you also need the reinforcement, typically that comes from reward, and that has to be externalized only until you have your intrinsic motivation that fires up, and then you're giving yourself your internal reward.
Yeah. And I do want to add a disclaimer, like there's nothing wrong with experts, right? We need them. Like, I'm hopeless with technology. Like, when something happens to my computer, I need a tech expert to come in and save the day for me. If I break my arm, I want the doctor to know what to do, right? There's nothing wrong with experts and expertise. I just think that we've become over-reliant on experts when a lot of the issues and challenges we're facing in the world, in the workplace, in systems, don't have easy answers. It's not like fixing a broken bone, right? We need to find a different way of being, of interacting, of thinking in order to solve these sorts of challenges that are not going away anytime soon.
No, I agree. And I think one of the challenges that is being recognised, but I think needs to be really amplified is, experts are great. Experts can provide insights and knowledge and, in the right learning mode, transmit skills, capability, behaviours, but where an expert is really going to struggle, even if, but especially unless they're working one-on-one with you, is to understand the individual context that the skill, learning, behaviour is going to be applied in. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you entirely. I think there's this inherent over-reliance on expert to give us the answer for us. And
there again is the authority relationship playing out.
Yeah. So let's sort of try and move into a progressive gear, and
sure.
let's talk about some ways in which we could try and improve this situation, and especially when we are both ourselves in the modality of trying to make the world better through our work and the work we do with leaders and individuals and couples. So let's just try and sort of aggregate and summarise these points that we've touched on so far, and some of the more salient ones about it's about doing, and it's about this sort of case study approach and really responding to what's happening in the environment. So not just those ones, but what specific sort of to-dos or to-don'ts or sort of general recommendations would you have for leaders who want to maybe take some of the things that we've touched on so far and adopt them as best you can to an unknown audience? Having said what I just said about experts conveying to an individual context, but are there any specific things where you would say, in my experience, I think this would be a good thing to try, or that would be a good thing to avoid?
I think just given what we've been talking about here, I think that an interesting kind of noticing exercise would be to bring attention to how authority relationships and relations are playing out in your individual life, in your life. I think that could be a very interesting process of self-inquiry and assessment and observation, and what's happening to you as an individual in the presence of authority, and who are the authorities in your life, and what happens to your agency and your creativity and your ability to step up or step in when that authority figure is around. And it's not a criticism of the authority, it's just about noticing what happens to you, because I think that a lot of change is precipitated by awareness. And we need to be able to notice and catch ourselves to become very curious about what's happening for us. So I think that could actually be a very interesting exercise. But along those lines, I'm a big believer that there is merit in knowing thyself, as Socrates famously said, that we need to invest in time and energy and resources into really deeply getting to know ourselves. What inspires us, what triggers us, what makes us happy, what brings us down, what motivates us, what tears us apart. And I think there are so many ways we can do that these days, whether it's a podcast or listening to a podcast and being exposed to new ideas, whether it's a TED talk, whether it's a retreat, whether it's a seminar, a lecture, a talk, talking to friends. I mean, there's so many different ways that we can, if we are open to it, really step in to get to know ourselves. And connected to that, I think we really need to the best of our ability, broaden our horizons. There's so much that we don't know. There's so many people out there that we don't know. We tend to live in bubbles and silos. And are there conscious, active ways that we can break beyond the silos that we are in? Because the broader our horizon in terms of what we understand, in terms of what we can see, what we can hold, what we can think about, the much more sustainable and durable our interventions are going to be in our leadership. So if I've never ever, heard the experience of someone, let's say an Indigenous person in Australia, how can I ever claim to think that I could know what's best for them?
Yeah.
Or represent them, right? Or speak for them? Anything of that kind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So, but how can I engage, and how can I, with intention and consciousness, do that? Are there books I can read, testimonials I can access, people I can speak to? Again, there's various media for it, but how can I do it? I think that's really important. And if you're interested in adaptive leadership, I think a great book to look at, to get into, is called Leadership on the Line, by two of the founders of adaptive leadership, Marty Linsky and Ron Heifetz. This is one of the seminal kind of textbooks of adaptive work, and it gives a very thorough overview and understanding of this modality. It's not obviously the only book, but it's I think a very useful one to get started.
Those are all excellent recommendations, and certainly the specific resources I'll be sure to put in the show notes. So if you're listening to this, just sort of scroll down and hyperlink away. I think that I love all of that. I think the addition that I would make, and this is certainly something that I need to do far more of, and I'm working on constantly, but I also do a lot of work with leaders on as well, is actually exploring your own experience and doing so in a systematized way. So think about specific challenges and problems that you're dealing with right now, and then think about versions of those problems that you've encountered before, as a basic noting exercise. Because I think, again, in our age of expert, we're far too inclined to externalize the solution, as opposed to internalize and look at essentially an innovation process of experimentation, even if that experimentation was, is anecdotal, was in the past, or look to very proximate experts. I think, and you can walk into most teams, and there'll be somebody there who knows a little bit more about something than you know, and you know a little bit more about something than they know, or you know equal amounts, or you hold equal amounts of knowledge, but your perspectives are different. But we might be too inclined to walk down the hallway and go talk to the boss, or to jump online and watch a TED talk. Let's collaborate, let's interact, let's be a bit more dynamic in our current environment. I think certainly there would be points of benefit that would come out of all of those things.
Absolutely, and to build on that, I think it's Esther Perel who talks about this, but there's also an ability to tap into ancestral assets and inspiration.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Yeah,
Tell me more
meaning
about
to think about how has my family over the years dealt with problem X or challenge Y, or how's my community responded historically to what's happening right now. And that in that kind of, I don't know that she calls it this, but I'm just calling it that for now, but this kind of ancestral inquiry, we may also find motivation, resources, perspectives, tools that we weren't consciously aware of before.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So yes, it can come from within ourselves individually, it can come within our family, but it can also become kind of living family, but it can also come from a much broader history that we all have with us, that we bring with us and carry with us into each present moment. And that can be a wonderful resource and asset that we have access to.
Yeah. Yeah, I read a book earlier in the year called Why We Don't Learn from History, which is a short read, and specifically talking about the sort of the situation in Europe that led to 2 world wars. But the sort of the keynotes are that we don't learn from history because it's overly externalized. The depiction of it is typically by the victors. So we only sort of look at one defined perspective of the causal factors and the events and the outcomes, and therefore it basically reduces the benefit of analysis of history. But that's the one thing, and then the second thing is this presumption that we're not going to make the same mistakes again because we're progressive. I think that in of itself would be a conversation, right? Again, I was having another conversation recently when we were talking about, again, this sort of false premise that evolution is slow, right? I mean, evolution as a journey plays out constantly, but evolution is highly accelerated by very intense stimuli, right? Basically by trauma, and that if you look at your own path as a leader, if I reflect on mine, the real leaps, the real development moments have come from a traumatic experience as a leader when you didn't deliver or you didn't stand up, and that the evolution that you received out of that was hyperinflated compared to just general success or carrying along and things not being so I mean the leadership traumas that I've experienced, inheriting a team for the first time and not really understanding what to do with them and how to manage those dynamics, taking a team through the GFC, dealing with complex leadership dynamics when I was going through a very intense personal time, and now leading a team through COVID. Like, these are the formative moments from which the salient learning opportunities will come. But so often people just kind of want to blank those times out and forget about them because they're painful and they're confronting and they're difficult to engage with.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the productive zone of disequilibrium, which is this healthy range of what we would call heat that needs to happen or needs to exist within a system in order for change to happen. But on the other side of that healthy range of heat, we could have too little heat, which is when we're comfortable and we sit back and it's someone else's job, nothing needs to change. But on the other side of that, there can be too much heat where we can burn out and we can get burnt. And the question there is, as people exercising leadership, how do we create an environment and hold an environment where the heat, the stress, what you call the trauma, I'm assuming little t trauma,
Sure, little t trauma,
is bearable,
right,
for the team, for progress to happen, but not too much and not too little that we will not get anywhere. And that's really one of the challenges of COVID right now, that for many, the heat is too much. It's just too much. And that actually will work against us. Where in other places, in certain teams, organizations, societies, whatever, it's bearable. It's allowed for incredible pivots and innovation and different ways of working, and a whole bunch of changes have happened in the world as a result of COVID. But we have to think about what's the intensity of that heat in the system. And is it productive, or is it going to burn us?
And to build on that, can we reframe the stress that we receive from the environment and from the stimuli, and look at sort of identifying and calling out what the sources of stress are, so that we can say, well, that's actually a good stressor and that's a bad stressor, and I need to manage that one over there, but I actually need to move in and lean into this stuff because that's the stuff that I'm going to learn from. And just to use your heat analogy and sort of reflect on the opposite one, I was listening to a podcast recently with a neuroscientist who was talking about how efficient cold is as a good stressor when you're trying to look at behaviour change, because as much as for an extended period of time can obviously be dangerous, but you can expose someone to cold for far longer than you can expose them to heat before they get into real trouble. And so when you look at stuff like the SEAL Team Buds training, when they're immersing people in cold and they're sleep depriving them, those are two sort of beneficial stressors in the short term that can sort of evoke a behaviour change, and you can measure something that you need to then calibrate against over here. So I absolutely agree with you, and I think at the moment what I'm trying to do and what we're trying to do as a team is we're trying to look at all of the stresses that we're experiencing right now. We're trying to say that's a good one that is provoking a productive, adaptive response. That's a bad one that is too much heat, to use your term, and that's going to cause us to burn out. We need to manage that in a different way very, very carefully. So look, thank you. That's what we've covered, just a plethora of topics at a fairly rapid rate. So I would hope that, but I'd be very certain that we're going to have stimulated some curiosity in anybody that might have listened to this or watched this. So if somebody has even just taken one thing out of what you've said and they're now wanting to explore more and find out more about what you do and what we've discussed today, what would be a source that people can productively engage with you or go to that you could steer some people towards?
Yeah, sure. Because the easiest is to go to my website.
Great.
Yeah, brandonsrot.com.au.
And we'll have that in the show notes. So again, scroll down.
Or on LinkedIn or Facebook. As I mentioned earlier, I'm quite a tech phobe and very tech challenged, but I do have these platforms.
Yeah.
So these are easy ways to connect, and I'm always open to a conversation. We can have a coffee, whether it's in person or virtual, we can make it happen. But yeah, I'd love to chat to whoever finds interest in any of these ideas or topics to continue the conversation.
Perfect. So Brandon, just to sort of bring this conversation to a close, I'd like to just invite you to just frame a question that might stimulate a bit of action and some doing from someone that's been listening to us converse today.
All right. One question that comes up is, what will you do with the disappointments that emerge from this conversation for you today?
Wow. I'm trying to formulate a response to that right now.
And I asked that question. Shall I explain why?
By all means, yeah.
I asked that question because there may be an expectation that I will give and have all the answers about adaptive leadership or about whatever it is that I've tried to talk about. And when that expectation is in place, you put me on the pedestal as an expert on a particular topic. But there's absolutely no way that I can satisfy all of those expectations or speak to all of those expectations right here, right now. So I have to imagine that there's a part of you, the listeners, who are somewhat disappointed. Maybe they didn't get every question answered, or maybe they didn't get every detail fully explained, or maybe it wasn't as perfectly said as they would want to hear it. So disappointment is a natural part of life and leadership. And so my question is, what will you do about it?
And my response is going to be go to brandonsrot.com.
.au.
And more of the answers will be there. But no, I think that's an incredibly poignant question. And yeah, how do people handle disappointment?
Yeah.
Did they respond with resentment and well, that wasn't what I signed up for, and I'm on to the next thing and kind of screw you? Or did they move in, and does disappointment become curiosity, and that's the beginning of something?
Yes. And is it my job as the expert or the authority to satisfy the disappointments? Or can you exercise your own leadership to find out more, to take the next step on your leadership journey, to ask the question, to visit the website, or whatever it is, right? But what do you do next?
I love that provocation, and that's a perfect place to leave it. So I will simply say thank you, Brandon, for everything that we've discussed and sort of conversed on over the years, and especially for what we've talked about today. And let's keep talking.
Absolutely, and thank you so much.
You'll find audio and video recordings for this episode, as well as links and related resources mentioned today in the podcast area of 4iLeadership.com/insights. This is the Better World Leaders podcast, brought to you by 4i Leadership.